Welcome everybody. Can content be code? A Drupal 8 case study from the Department of Justice and Regulation in Victoria. So my name is Sam Presser. I'm a senior website designer and developer with the department. And my co-presenter today is Simon Hobbs. Simon is a Drupal consultant and architect with many years of diverse commercial experience working with Drupal. The people that we want to talk to today are primarily evaluators and technical leads. We want to help managers and product evaluators understand the readiness of Drupal 8, and for those familiar with Drupal 7, we'll walk through what we've learned so far working with Drupal 8, including what's the same and what can and possibly should be done differently. So we're from the online services team within the Department of Justice and Regulation. We develop, support, host and maintain most of the department's 35-odd websites, half a dozen or so intranets, and about 25 line of business transactions. Now, a transaction for us is any online form that the public uses to engage with our services. They might be as simple as a website feedback form, or they might be as complex as the account management console that's been built for the Working with Children cardholders. Our current world runs IBM Wickham, which is a proprietary CMS. Now, these sites run on boxes which are in our data centres, inside our network, and they're hosted by our shared services provider. So it's a very, very old world view. So we're on a journey to move away from this to something brave and new. We're moving away from self-hosted hardware into cloud-hosted platforms, and from the proprietary CMS world to the brave new world of open source. So being one of the larger departments in Victorian government, we support websites for our business units, some stat bodies, and also a few for other departments. Now, some of our clients, like the various commissioners, might come to us perhaps every third year for an update. Now, they just want a reliable platform that's easy for their content managers to use. Others, like births, deaths and marriages or working with children, have much more complex site requirements, which means that it's not uncommon for them to have multiple enhancements in the pipeline. It's these people that we really need to be aiming to support. So let's introduce you to a product owner for one of our more complex sites. This is Bobby. As the product manager, it's Bobby's job to make sure that the development teams are working on the stories that deliver the maximum business value for his space. So let's have a look at what Bobby has in the works at the moment. Right now, Bobby has a Scrum team dedicated to developing a new line of business transaction to move a current face-to-face process online. At the same time, an existing product is having a new feature added so that it supports an upcoming legislation change. Then outside the application development space, Bobby's comms team started work on redeveloping a new section of their website. Now, each of these features may involve one or many different types of assets, but what you'll see here is that content is a key part of every single one of those. So some of the problems that we face supporting Bobby. We need to make sure that the business as usual content authors can update their content on the live site while new features are being developed. We can't look at locking off certain areas of the production site while we're developing. It would tie the business's hands too much. Then before launch, Bobby wants to send out a link to his stakeholders to sign off on a new feature before it goes live. How do we support the business in testing one new feature end-to-end, independent of the other ones? And if that release, heaven forbid, goes pear-shaped, Bobby would expect to be able to roll back all assets contained within that release and have production appearing exactly as it was before. So we want to be able to support Bobby in all of this. We want to be able to package up all of our assets into a feature, including content, and to be able to deploy them consistently. This is what we want Drupal 8 to help us do. In addition to Bobby's needs, we also have some architectural challenges. When we have 42 odd sites to maintain an active business as usual authoring and feature development cycle on, how do we solve some of these problems without spidering into the hundreds of environments? How do we tag both development resources and content? How do we make sure that the content authors are happy and that the system that we've created is easy for them to use? When we're working with multiple features in lower environments, how do we make sure that we know which environment is running which version of which feature? And how do we make sure that we keep support and hosting costs down? So there are a few approach principles I'd like to touch on that are allowing us to better support Bobby. The first of these is continuous integration. Now, continuous integration is a development practice where developers regularly integrate code into a shared repository. Each check-in is then verified by an automated build server, which runs tests and builds the application, giving the team rapid feedback on any issues that may be introduced during the cycle. Continuous delivery is the next step after continuous integration. What continuous delivery does is make sure that the product is being built in small increments that can be deployed to production each time a new feature passes QA. It means we get to ship new small features very, very regularly. It also means we can do it much more confidently. Now, the CI and CD principles have been around for quite a while, but the models are much more familiar to developers and the SysOps world than they are to the content and CMS worlds. The third thing I want to chat about today is the config as code idea. Now, to explore this one, let's have a look at what was in a feature. Now, a feature is usually comprised of code, content, and configuration in various shapes or forms. The developers have had it sorted for a little while, with the idea of committing assets to centralised repositories. So code, applications, and even database updates can be tagged for release, have automated builds run on them, have new branches created for development, you name it. There's a lot of power and a lot of flexibility there. Now, the config as code principle extends these advantages to configuration. By treating all environment configuration as code, we're able to create lower environments that are perfectly in line with production, and it also sets the groundwork for auto-scaling environments. It means a really happy DevOps team because we stop having the old problem of, oh, we can't quite solve this one because it only occurs in production. But we still have content left over here, all on its own. Now, in the past, migration of content normally happens via some CMS-specific service. With IBM's Wickham, it was a process called syndication. And with Drupal, there are various solutions. The features module has been used, deploy module. I'm sure that everybody in the audience can name me half a dozen more. And we find that these processes are hard to tie in to the wider development cycle. So we want to ask the question, what if content could start being treated as code? Now, this idea makes Bobby pretty happy because it means that his entire feature is rolled up in the repository. It means he can have a lot more confidence in what's going into production. But it opens up some pretty big questions for us. Can we start managing content the same way that we can, say, a style sheet? And if we're managing content as code, do we even need a database? So our perception of Drupal 7 so far. We built a few sites with Drupal 7, so we've kind of put our toe in the water. From them, we've learnt a few things. We've learnt that we've kind of inherited this big lump of a database, which isn't particularly transparent. I keep hearing about the need to protect this idea of a canonical database, but in return it makes it hard to roll incremental changes through environments with confidence. So I'm feeling it's kind of a very one-sided relationship at the moment. We take a lot of care of that database, but it isn't potentially being as useful as it could be. The migration of site changes is challenging in Drupal 7 too. So the features module has been used in the past for it with some pretty kind of average results. And we didn't feel that we could construct a release cycle with Drupal 7 that we could have full confidence in. It was also a pretty challenging beast to tie into a continuous integration, continuous delivery stack. But if we don't go Drupal 7, let's look at Drupal 8. So we knew we had some pretty big risks going with Drupal 8. We knew we'd have a steep learning curve, the question of whether we'd find talent, whether it would be stable enough, would Contrib be ready enough. But what we did know is that it was written to support the config as code model, and this was hugely exciting to us. Suddenly, integrating Drupal into a continuous integration and continuous delivery stack starts to look a lot more possible. And migrating site changes controlled in configuration becomes simpler and much more transparent. And getting in at the ground level means that we can start to help push that config as code model just about as far as it can go. So to explore these ideas further, I'm going to hand over to Si, who's going to talk about how we're solving some of these with Drupal 8's capabilities.
Thank you, Sam. That was extremely eloquent. I feel really supported here. You sort of know where we are as far as an organisation. Looking forward towards Drupal 8. When I started at Department of Justice, the decision to go with Drupal 8 had been made, partly through the interview that I had, where I said that config is going to be awesome in Drupal 8, and I sort of like had my fingers crossed behind my back. So when I am looking at whenever I'm looking at any kind of implementation in any sort of with any sort of technology, as an open source one, I'm trying to get an 80-20 rule between existing patterns and innovation. I want to see as much as possible that we're doing things the same way as most of the rest of the community. But when we come into, when we were looking at Drupal 8, and when I started, it hadn't had a release yet, you make the assumption that a lot of the patterns that we're seeing in the community around Drupal 7 and so forth, that they're going to evolve. We want to avoid like locking down the way we do things. We want to avoid technical debt. We want to avoid debt around our processes, our developer processes. And I suppose right from the outset that we've tried to approach the problem as much as possible, like loosely coupling all of our components, so that if we realise that we've made a mistake with one part of it, that the community is going this direction, or this tool turns out to be awesome, we can swap that out. So when you're looking at the 80-20 rule, another way to look at that is, what can we lock in now that we know is absolutely certain? And so we had a few things that were specific to us and a few things that are general. One thing that was specific to us is we made a decision right from the start to offload all of our digital asset management to a third-party solution. I'll touch on what that is later. The idea of this is we talk about Drupal being code, database and files, those three. And so if we're going to be deploying things, what are we doing with the files? Because we've got 30 plus sites, and because some of the assets are reused across those sites, I was particularly interested in being able to step away from the old Drupal model where you get a Drupal site and there's a whole bunch of files in the file system, and yeah, there's a table that manages them, but versioning is a little bit suspect, and sometimes, and especially when you're looking at the media situation in Drupal 7, which was pretty terrible. I'm still waiting to see that mature in Drupal 8 when you look at what's happening in the media space. So being able to offload it took a lot of risk away from us. We've got transactions. We don't have web. We don't have the web form in our sites. We've got a Java-based system, and we've got teams of Java developers who are running all of our transactions. So a lot of that personalisation, a lot of that user interaction with our sites can be offloaded onto that system, and we would continue to do that as much as possible. So as much as possible, we want to manage things in code. We recognise the visibility, the transparency of that. Our loose coupling. We're looking at things like, we knew we wanted to loose couple, and I'll show you in a bit, like something like Composer has allowed us to go down that path. And we knew we wanted good test coverage. So there's just a few of the things that we sort of knew we were 100% sure of. And the following slides will get into some more detail about some of that. So with the digital asset management, just touch on this. We selected Intermedia DB as an asset manager after doing a review of a good half dozen solutions. It has a Drupal 7 module, and we are currently in the process of porting that to Drupal 8. So we have a GitHub location for that. We still haven't managed to make contact with the Drupal 7 developers. So that will give us the ability to effectively serve all of our sites, serve 30 plus sites in terms of digital assets. To silo some assets in separately for sites and to allow some assets to be shared. Okay, so there's some of our wins. So a lot of this you can maybe look at later and you can review, because what we're really trying to do, what I'm trying to do in this presentation is I'm trying to give you a real whistle-stop tour of what we've touched on in Drupal 8, because I know how valuable that data is when you're going into a new project. So just to touch on migrations, migrations have been excellent. Like any time we've touched on migrations, our source is actually XML. We have saved, effectively saved exports from Wickham, and we intend to use the same saved export for each of our sites that we do migration on, and therefore we expect the structure to be the same. If you haven't looked at the migration system, it's essentially 90% of our migration configuration of how we do our migration is stored in our YAML files in our configuration. And what we've found is that this is a really good example of where config in Drupal 8 is coming to the fore, because not only is it great from a developer point of view, but it's really great from a business point of view, that you can demo something like a migration and you can talk through what that actually looks like in a very business readable way, I guess. So there on the right, I've just got some examples of our migration from specifying our sources using XPath. Here we get into the developer bit, specifying our sources using XPath and mapping those sources to fields in Drupal. So I won't get into any more detail on that. So Drupal console is another quick one I wanted to highlight for you, because I wasn't aware of it when I started on Drupal 8. Drupal console, I believe, is us getting off the island in terms of command line interface. It takes us from Drush, which is hugely procedural, and also Drush is, I believe, quite bogged down in historic workarounds. Whereas Drupal console, if you're coming from, if you're coming, say, as a Ruby programmer or a Python programmer, they've understood and had consoles for a long time. So suddenly you're coming into this world that makes sense, rather than this Drush world, which is a lot of procedural code that we can execute off the command line. So we are writing all of our commands in console whenever we need a new command. We're still using Drush, but I would expect, and part of this presentation is about predictions, I really would expect that it won't take too long for console use to actually overtake Drush use. Just wait and see when Moshe switches. So it is still fairly alpha. We have found a lot of a little bit of flakiness in it, like just missing things that we're sort of like, we should sort of thought that would be in there by now, but it's not. Another thing I wanted to point you at is Vagrant and Ansible. If you're looking at the patterns in the community, if you look at pretty much any of the examples of Vagrant out there in open source projects, Ansible's the way to go. Our sysops team are using Ansible to do our deployment into AWS. So to be able to sort of to pick that up and use it for our Vagrant stack inside our development team means that we've got a lot of visibility between each other. We can read each other's code in some ways. If you wanted to have a closer look at how Ansible is being used in VMs, you might look at, say, Beatbox or Drupal VM. Another quickie, and I'll just be really brief on this, I would also predict that makefiles will die pretty soon. Makefiles will essentially die once Drupal.org infrastructure supports Composer. I'm hoping that's possible. But pretty much we are doing all of our builds directly from Composer, no makefiles at all. And that's working really well for us. And I would suspect that in theory, you only need makefiles if you want Drupal.org to do your distribution builds. It still works pretty well. And an example of Drupal.org using a distribution build that also has a Composer build would be something like agov. If you go and have a look at that, it's a really good example of the two worlds still in play. Just some technical stuff for anyone who's actually interested in following up on Composer, follow some links. Testing, again, really briefly, we've said on PHP Unit and Behat, there's a lot of projects out there, and again, I'll point to AGOV as an example that have, the integration, like out of the box, Composer's is like building your test tools, which is fantastic. So it's reuse. You can reuse other people's tools. Keep an eye out for PHP Unit support in Drupal.org test infrastructure, and hopefully, so we've actually banned simple test. Even though that's kind of weird sometimes because that's what like Core's using for a lot of its tests. But we're trying to stick to the two things, Behat or PHP Unit. Okay, so just getting into content and config staging, which is where the sensationalist kind of like presentation title came from. This is, I think, kind of the most interesting thing for me around Drupal 8. Traditionally, and if you go and look at all of the different ways of deploying things in Drupal 7, Drupal 8, historically we've had this separation between content and configuration and code. So features would let you deploy your configuration and obviously your code. And your content, if you're looking at a bunch of different solutions for content, more often, we saw in a previous presentation in here, there was an example of Drupal 7 deploying content and it created menu links for you. That's fantastic. But that's kind of like a side effect because no one's going to want their content to be deployed. If the menu links don't work, you can't explain that to a business, where you probably can explain if your view doesn't get updated that that's got to be a code deployment. So I've always been aware of that. I've always avoided features personally in Drupal 7. I didn't feel like that it was easy for people to actually learn to use in a comprehensive way. And if you can't do it comprehensively, then let's keep it simple. So the question has really been, how far can we go in Drupal 8? So in terms of the configuration side, which we've seen some YAML files before, it's awesome. I was kind of blown away at how stable and how flexible and full-featured configuration management in Drupal 8 is, and I really do predict that there's going to be a lot of innovation around this in this space. I won't jump ahead. I'm going to talk about a few components, so I'll just keep it there. So my feeling was that the very first, right off the bat, it's like configuration's awesome. Not really sure what system we're going to use to deploy it. I could see that Drupal, like the way everyone thinks in the Drupal community is like, oh, our configuration, we want to push configuration from this server to this server, and that'll be Drush or that'll be whatever. And I've really stepped back and gone, I actually think it's so powerful that there'll be other ways to do it. To give you an idea of what that looks like, I mean, how powerful is being able to diff your config like that? No longer do we have things that are serialized in a database that you can't really see the difference easily without sort of, exploding that data out and having a look at it. So here we've changed the view, we've changed the number of items per page, and when we've exported that configuration over the top of the previous piece of configuration, that's what a git diff looks like. Very transparent. So as you can probably guess, what I'm trying to do here is just step you through some different points, like different islands, in the Zelda game that we're landing on and going, here's this amazing new tool. So in this situation, what I'm showing you here is what we've got is a live site where we've changed the configuration, and then we've got a directory that's had all the configuration in that live site exported to it. There's a drush command for that, and there's a console command for that. And what running this command allows you to effectively do an in-state diff between that live site and your directory of configuration in YAML files. So it's telling me which YAML files differ from the live site. It's telling me which ones would be deleted if I exported everything from the live site and so forth. An important thing, I'll probably pick it up later, but the really important thing is that Drupal core is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for this, and this is what sort of blew me away. It's got a dependency resolution system inside it to determine that certain pieces of the config depend on other pieces of the config and so forth. So this command is not a complex, long-running command. A lot of the actual fundamentals are in there in core. I think we've been, this is actually contributed to the console by my colleague Adam Bramley. And I think he stole a little bit of stuff from features in order to get this to work exactly the way it's working. So features 8 in Drupal 8. So yeah, I touched on that dependency resolution before. So Drupal can resolve config dependencies. If you delete a block, Drupal knows that all the configuration that is now redundant or dependent on that block or vice versa. If you were to have a try of doing something like Drupal config export using the console command and include dependencies, you will see that you can pick a single piece of config and then the dependency resolution will just go through and find all the configuration that depends on that. So at this point, I'm feeling really confident in what's going on in Drupal 8. I'm starting to get pretty excited and starting to look what's happening in the content side of things. So how am I going for time? Probably got 5 minutes. Just make sure. So we know we've got code as code. We know we've got config as code. So where is the line? Sorry. Where do we draw the line between content as code? I mean, where is that line? It's quite arbitrary sometimes. Sometimes the business thinks of things that are changing as being config, and we go, no, it's actually a menu item, so it's actually content, or vice versa. So where's the line between config and content? I think it's quite blurry. So the questions are, why would you want to build a site completely from code? And I think the answer, perhaps, Sam really illustrated that. We have some sites that are really high compliance, they get a lot of visibility, they want ministerial approval of any changes. So if we could actually be able to describe everything that was going to go out in the new release as a change between this file system and this file system, which we have in our version control in Git, then we're actually able to provide a high level of certainty about what is actually going on in our deployment. So as I said before, we've got an advantage where I believe we've got our digital asset management system. We know Drupal can handle dependencies, and so we get down to this thing: is what's that canonical database still doing? Why is it the golden child? Why can't we stand up any environment that is our latest site without having to go and get a dump of that database and bring it in as well? So just talking about content, so just briefing on content export, we're going to see, I predict we'll see a growing practice of content export. We've got an example here if you look in AGov, there's a default content module by Lee Rowlands, and you'll actually see that there's some exported configuration, which is a bunch of UUIDs for content that when a module gets enabled, all that content gets brought in. So they're brought in. So those UUIDs are referenced inside some JSON exported content configuration. I think I've got 2 separate images there, actually. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't clear. So the second image below is an excerpt from one of those JSON files, and you can see that it's what the body field looks like. The exported content from the body field, it's got a value which is the lorem ipsum, and it's got a format, and it's got so on and so on. So we have examples of content being exported into code, which I think that we'll only see more and more of. And then we're also looking at systems such as in Drupal 7, we've got deploy, and another one in Drupal 8 that I'll mention in a bit is entity pilot. So we're talking about pushing content between servers. So that piece of content that gets pushed between those servers, what is that? For security reasons, it's probably an encrypted file, but on some level, but fundamentally it's being able to take those changes in those databases and define them as a payload on a service call. So our exploration then went, and again, we don't know if we're going to go the full distance on this, but our exploration at the moment is involving taking Entity Pilot and seeing what we can do with it. So Entity Pilot, just to give it a bit of a plug, I guess, is it's a content staging solution for Drupal 8. It allows you to push your content to multiple sites with different configuration, with different content types, so it's very flexible. We don't have that requirement. It also allows you to sync and do merge resolution on your content. We sort of have that requirement. And it has a UI for a lot of this stuff as well. And I've got a link at the end of the presentation for you to look further at it. So our requirements are a little bit simpler than what Entity Pilot does, but we're really interested in this notion that it knew how to look at our content, put it into something, and then bring it in on the other end. The thing, we just wanted to swap that from being a service payload to being changes in a file system. So we've gone from, so what we did, and this also illustrates how powerful the Symfony stuff is now, where we've taken Entity Pilot, and that's kind of the way Entity Pilot works. You've got a little server there, and we've swapped out part of it, like the transporter part of it, very easily. We're not hacking anything, it's just the way dependency injection works and so forth. And we've got that writing those changes into Git, onto our file system and essentially into Git. So it doesn't call Git, but since they're changes on the file system, we can diff them and commit them. And that's our current trials. I won't say that's the solution we're going to settle on, but it's actually allowed us to just to say, okay, that bit works. We really want to explore this Git side. We want to explore what our content looks like in code. And if you feel like talking to me about it a bit further afterwards, feel free. So really it boils down, in my opinion, I hope this has illustrated it, but just touching on a whole bunch of stuff, I think you should really watch this space on Drupal 8. I think there's a lot of emerging patterns that are going to be happening in the space. And hopefully we'll be at a future conference where we can talk more about what we're settling on and where we're at. Jen, just quickly, so basically presentation's finished, but I learn a lot from other people's code. These are the main projects that have inspired me to the exploration in Drupal 8. And then I also want to specifically thank these people who have given me a lot of support. So we've got Lee Rowlands, who's Entity Pilot and a previous Next dev. Adam Bramley is our developer in our team, and he's doing a lot of commits on Drupal console, and he's doing the Intermedia DB port. And then Tom Tugod is a Melbourne guy, and he's been working on Beatbox, which is a Vagrant VM, configurable Vagrant VM solution, which is worth looking at as well. So, and then thanks to all the colleagues, and thank you to Sam. And that's the end of the presentation. I've really taken it to the wire. I don't know if we've got any time for questions. Yep, I'll take a question. Hey.
Just a quick one. What are your thoughts on revisions, considering if you're exporting your content to Git, therefore you don't technically need revisions anymore because you have them, but have you...
I could have actually mentioned that at some point, that was an assumption that we would make. I believe that it could be possible if we manage to get all the bits connected together and we've got the fundamental building blocks. But if we wanted to actually build a site out that was running on a certain date, on a certain commit, it should be possible to do that. So as long as someone can clone the site, can run composer install to bring in all the dependencies and all the versions that were there on November 7, 2016, and then build that site and all the content comes in, it should be the same site. So yeah, I think we're going to go down the path of having revisions because we want to use the workflow stuff in potentially in an editorial stand-up. So we're going to have the classic workflow where we will have the revisions, but effectively the revisions will become redundant after a while because we can get to that some other way.
Last question over there.
Ben.
Have you thought about how you would solve, if all your content went into Curd, how you would solve like user submitted content, like comments and things like that?
So that's, yeah, I probably didn't highlight that enough earlier, but we do have a few assumptions that make it possible for us. And one of those is the transactions. We have offloaded the transactions onto our Java platform. And I could have gone a step further, is that every time someone says to us, we would like to have this user interaction, then we would our plan, our policy more or less is to say, well, what service can we use to provide that? You know, do we use, the Discuss or something like that for comments, or do we, if we want personalisation, we should have a personalisation server. You know, we shouldn't be personalising that content, given the nature of the organisation and the way we work. So yeah, so offload.
Yeah, it's quick.
Did you consider like ditching Drupal altogether and just using like a static site generator?
It had been decided to already use Drupal, and I personally believe that a static site generator, you're just moving the complexity to a different part of your build. Like, I mean, effectively, we've got a static site generator when we when we've got everything in cache. Like these are static sites, more or less, if we've offloaded all the interaction. So Varnish is our static site generator. So yeah, we had, but I suppose it came down to the fact that the business had chosen Drupal for other reasons. And we don't want to throw away the advantages of Drupal because we'll have all this Drupal expertise, and if we need to do something totally different over here, we put it on Acquia or do whatever, like we can, but we don't need to for most of our sites. All right, cut into the lunch, Mossy.
I'll ask him that.
Okay, no worries, thank you, and I want to say thanks to Sam, that was awesome.